reddish brown hair that's down today. I have a black mask on my face, so you can't actually see my mouth moving. So I apologize about that since I'm at the airport. And my pronouns are she, her, and I've been doing this Dynamics thing for about 21 years, but I'm pretty new to Microsoft, just about 2 years, and I'm a fast track solution architect. So today I am going to be diving into all the details about what's going on with the HR infrastructure merge coming over to the finance and operations application infrastructure. So I'm going to give you an overview of what's happening, walk you through some of the frequently asked questions that we're hearing from customers and partners alike, talk you through the timelines of what's happening, and then we'll talk about some things to help you prepare for migration, what that process looks like. And I've got a short little video demonstration that I'll be showing you of that migration process in LCS. I'll also, if time allows, I've got some pre and post migration scenarios. If we don't have time, they're a great kind of appendix resource, but I will certainly try to make sure we've got plenty of time for questions at the end. So with that, let's just go ahead and dive right in. Starting out with an overview of what's happening with the Dynamics 365 infrastructure merge. So as many of you are probably aware, we currently have two different sets of human resources functionality. One set of that functionality is in our standalone application that we refer to as Dynamics 365 Human Resources. And that second set of functionality is the Human Resources module that lives within Dynamics 365 Finance. And what we're doing is we are merging all of our HR offerings and functionality together into the same infrastructure, and that infrastructure will be the finance and operations application infrastructure. There are really four key pillars that we're focusing on and benefits that you will get from this infrastructure merge. The first pillar is really around creating clarity. So it's confusing for customers and partners as to which set of functionality should be used. So by bringing the offering together and creating one application that can be used for all your human resources needs, hopefully that will reduce some of that confusion. The second pillar is really around extensibility. We heard a lot of feedback from the community, customers and partners alike, that you wanted a more extensible solution. And although we offered a lot of extensibility options through the Power Platform, it wasn't giving customers enough flexibility within the application like we have in the finance and operations infrastructure. So by merging all of our code and functionality back into the finance and operations infrastructure, we are giving you that ability to create X++ extensions, but you'll still have the power of the Power Platform as well to make extensions and create solutions that work for your organization. Our third pillar is really around enhancing capabilities. So there has been a lot of research and development and efforts that have been put into that standalone application, and we hadn't really been developing the human resources module in finance. So by bringing those all together, we're enhancing the experience, as well as allowing customers who want all of their HR data to live in the same database to have that situation. It's also giving us the ability to take advantage of platform investments that have been happening over the last several years in the finance and operations infrastructure, such as the ability to edit embedded Power BI, the Azure Data Lake, the list goes on. Things that we weren't able to uptake in the standalone application because of infrastructure differences. This will also prepare us to be able to innovate more in the future and take advantage of all of those new platform enhancements and features and things that are happening with the Power Platform all up. So from a high level, and I've got another slide a little bit later on where I'll be going into more detail on this, but at a very high level, the transition time frame is really going to be dependent upon your individual configurations, your customers, project plans and rollouts and so on. The new features have already begun to roll out. So starting with 10.0.25 is the first release where we've introduced the merged functionality. And to ensure that customers and partners have enough time to move to this new infrastructure, we are suggesting that you plan within the next 12 to 18 months from when the tooling is released, that you've got it on your plan and your roadmap to move to that new infrastructure. So for customers that are currently only using the HR module in Dynamics 365 Finance, there are no changes that are actually necessary. Customers that are using finance and supply chain, commerce, project operations can start to take advantage of the functionality immediately. So again, starting in 10.0.25, you can enable that functionality by going into feature management and enabling those features. Some of the features are being deployed automatically, and just like all features in feature management, some are on by default, some have prerequisites and so on, and some of them are preview right now. So we always recommend that you go take a look at the wave release plans out on the doc site to get the most up-to-date information about preview and general availability of each of those features. We are going to be requiring customers that have Dynamics 365 finance or supply chain licenses to move to the Dynamics 365 human resource licenses if you're using the human resources module inside of finance. So you'll have until January 31st, 2025, or when your contract ends. So if you have an EA or a CSP that's up for renewal, you'll need to move to that new licensing and license any users who are using the HR functionality with the Dynamics 365 human resources. If it's cheaper, and in many cases it may be, to move to that new licensing sooner, you have the right to do that at any time. We do always recommend that if you've got ISV solutions, integrations, and so on, that if you are using the HR module and plan to start to implement new features and functionality, that you work closely with your partner to kind of determine that plan and your go forward. So customers that are using either the standalone Dynamics 365 Human Resources app, or customers that are using both human resources and finance and operations, supply chain, commerce, project ops, and so on, there are kind of two steps that are going to happen. The first step is what we're calling the lift and shift. This really is a true kind of infrastructure migration of your Dynamics 365 Human Resources standalone application over to the finance and operations infrastructure. So you'll create a new empty finance and operations LCS project and environment that you'll migrate your current environment into. And this process is going to be mostly automated. It's really important to note that all customers will be required to take this step as well. For customers that have both applications, finance and human resources, there's an optional second step that customers can choose to take. So if it makes sense for your organization to merge your data together into a single environment or a single database, you'll be able to use some data migration packaging tools to export your data and import it into your finance and operations environment. This process is expected to be a mostly manual process, and there will be a lot of decisions that will need to be made as you're importing and exporting that data. Like I said, customers will have an option to make this merge. It's not going to be mandatory, and there is no timeline or deadline when customers can do that. But we will require all customers to migrate to the finance and operations infrastructure. So I want to talk through a few of the frequently asked questions, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. I do encourage you, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat, and I will try to address those towards the end. But these are some of the most common ones that we have been hearing. So the first question is, what's next? So again, for customers that are on the standalone Dynamics 365 human resources infrastructure, as soon as our tooling becomes available, we will be requiring customers to make that move within 12 to 18 months. In terms of the infrastructure merge being completed, there's kind of two angles you can take to this question. From a code merge and a functionality standpoint, we are expecting at this point 10.0.28, and I do have a timeline slide that I'll be showing here next that will walk through in more detail. But from a migrating from your standalone application to the F&O infrastructure, obviously that's going to be dependent upon each customer and partner that is needing to make a migration. But again, we are going to be putting a deadline on that 12 to 18 months from when that tooling is going to be available. From a compensation standpoint, this is a question that we've been getting, pretty frequently. Will there be a compensation? And the short answer to that is no. We are not planning to compensate customers or partners for making this update, taking this update, and migrating. We are viewing the lift and shift as a, really an infrastructure change. In a lot of ways, it's not all that much different than when we moved from infrastructure as a service to the service fabric infrastructure. So we expect that it's minimal downtime and not a lot of effort for customers to take this update and migrate their environments. If there is a need to escalate, there is a process that you can use to escalate. We do have an email address that you can use to help escalate. That email address is d365hrmigrationhelp@microsoft.com. And I'll type that into the chat right now for you so you've got it in case you do need it. Right, so I've pasted that into the chat for you. If you do have a need to escalate, you've got a specific customer situation with questions that need to be answered, that sort of thing, you can certainly use this alias to email those specific questions that you might have and to escalate. And the last question that we've been getting frequently is what if I just purchased Dynamics 365 Human Resources? And so in this situation, if you just purchased Dynamics 365 Human Resources and you only have the standalone application, you will be required to migrate to the new infrastructure. There are no licensing changes for customers that only have human resources licenses. And when I get to the timeline slide, I'll talk a little bit more about kind of what's happening when you can migrate, what licenses are required, that sort of thing. But the minimums and the license costs for Dynamics 365 Human Resources are not changing. All right, so what I want to do now is switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the timelines of when this migration is happening. So from an infrastructure merge standpoint, in 10.0.25, which went into preview in the January timeframe, is when we merged what we like to call internally the core HR functionality. So that includes all of personnel management, business processes, task management, compensation, electronic reporting, employee development, employee self-service, learning, and the legacy benefits management module. In 10.0.26, which is available in preview now and is expected to be generally available soon, is when we've merged in benefits and leave and absence. And these two releases are by and large 90% or more of the functionality that exists in the standalone application. But there are a few things that are kind of, we'll call them stragglers, that are expected to come in 10.0.27. So one of those things is the applicant tracking system, or ATS integration. So we released some new APIs to integrate with ATS solutions. Those are expected in 27, as well as the people workspace. And 10.0.27 is also when we expect to prevent customers from deploying a brand new HR lifecycle services project, and that's when you'll be able to start making new projects on the finance and operations infrastructure to deploy just Dynamics 365. There are some changes that have to be made to LCS to allow you to create a project if you've only got 5 human resources licenses, or really any amount of human resources licenses for that matter. Currently, the logic in LCS is checking to see that you have 20 of the finance or supply chain licenses. So we are making some updates and changes to LCS to support that kind of difference where we allow HR to only have the 5 licenses. Then in 10.0.28 is when our migration tooling to take your existing standalone HR environments and move them over to the finance and operations infrastructure is expected to be available. This is also when our Microsoft Teams app for leave and absence will be integrated in. And we're also going to be introducing dual write packages for all of the HR related data. One thing that's important to note about that is that currently we have the Dataverse integration in the standalone application, and it is being deprecated as a part of this infrastructure merge. And the replacement for that is the dual write packages. So instead of our kind of custom way of duplicating and its own version of dual write, if you will, we'll be moving to the standard framework for dual write. And then looking ahead in the December 22 and moving forward is when we expect to have the merge tooling available, which is going to be a series of data packages and other tools to help you migrate your data. There's still a lot of planning work happening around this, but we are expecting to build additional data entities along with data packages to make this process as easy as possible for customers that do want to merge their environments together. If you have both human resources and another finance and operations app installed in your organization. We're also going to be looking to build out tooling to help with migrating Azure Blob Storage and document handling, for example. So from a migration planning and process standpoint, what I want to start with here is kind of what you can expect during this lift and shift migration, which all customers will be required to do if you are using the standalone application. This does not apply to customers that are only using the human resources module within finance. So a new finance and operations environment is going to be created as a part of that migration tooling. I'll be showing a short demo of this in just a few minutes, but basically this process is highly automated, and we have a new migrate button in LCS where you can pick your source and target. There's no need to merge your databases or environments as a part of this process. We are literally just picking up your existing database and moving it to the new infrastructure, as well as your blob storage and moving it to the new infrastructure. There will be tooling in place to help you test this process and validate it. You'll be able to repeat the migration as many times as you want in your sandbox. And then once you've validated that whole process works as expected, you will then be able to repeat that process in your production environment. This is all done through creating a brand new LCS project. We expect that there will be minimal downtime. We've done some initial testing with the largest HR database, or I should say a database that's equally as large as the largest database that our customers have. And just to give you a little bit of a benchmark, that particular database move took less than 2 hours. We will be notifying customers and kind of phasing out the migration. And I use the term auto migration here a little bit loosely because we won't be automatically migrating anyone's production environment, but we will be kind of enabling the functionality and getting you started on this process to help you along and doing that kind of in phases and rollouts. So as we get there, we'll be notifying customers and kind of getting you prepared to go click the button. Again, we do recommend that you work with your partner to kind of determine the best path forward based on each customer's unique situation. So a couple of migration facts before I kind of switch over and do a quick video demonstration for you. The first point I want to make here is that, again, all customers are going to be required to migrate. There will be a deadline for that migration. Oops, I clicked next a little prematurely there. And it's important to note that the Dataverse environment that is attached to your human resources environment is not actually going to be migrated. We are simply picking up your HR database and your Azure Blob Storage and moving those and pointing your new finance and operations environment back to your existing Dataverse environment. It will be required that you have to manually create a new LCS project and go through project onboarding and all the normal steps that you would do in LCS to deploy a finance and operations environment. And we will require customers to go through this process in a sandbox environment before you can do it in a production environment. Also important to note that because this is an F&O LCS project, all the normal onboarding process and go live assessment process that you go through for finance and operations will now apply to those new environments. So if you're not familiar with that, if you've only ever done human resources, there are lots of great resources available out on Docs and Tech Talks and the Learn site where you can learn more about how to deploy and go live with finance and operations apps. So with that, I've got a short little demo here that I want to play for you to walk you through that process. So when you're inside of LCS, you're going to use the plus icon to create a new LCS project. You will select the option to create a finance and operations LCS project, and then you'll want to select implementation. Because I already have an F&O LCS project, I get a warning and I have to click yes to confirm. I'll need to create a project name. So I'll type in here some details. So I'll just call this HR migration test. You can optionally enter in a detailed description. And there's a new field here called project custom type, where you'll need to select Microsoft Dynamics 365 Human Resources Migration. This drop-down box, the label in that field might change to sub-project type, but after you select the terms and conditions, you'll click Create. It'll take a minute or so for it to create the new LCS project, and once it's done processing that request, it'll refresh the screen like you see here, and it will start to load your new LCS project. So once this loads up, on the left-hand side of the screen where you see the Action Center, these are all the standard actions that you see in a finance and operations LCS project. You'll still want to make sure that you're setting up your project milestones, doing your project onboarding, and so on. But it's important to note over on the right-hand side, there is one little minor difference, is that we have both a configure button and a migrate button. The migrate button is what's kind of new and different, but you'll notice they're all grayed out. And they're grayed out because I have not completed the LCS onboarding process in this particular project. So once you've gone through the entire LCS onboarding process and you click on that migrate button, you'll be brought to a new dialog that looks like this, where you can enter in the details. Because many HR customers have more than one LCS project for HR, especially if it's an older deployment. If you needed more than one sandbox, you had to make additional LCS projects to deploy those. And so you'll be able to use that drop-down box to select another LCS project. And then once you select the LCS project, you can select the specific environment that you want to migrate. We also have an option where you can choose whether or not you want to create a new Power Platform environment, or if you want to use an existing one. And then you'll give it a name. And so that topology name is going to be like test or UAT, prod, et cetera, whatever type of environment you're doing. And you'll click on that next button. Once you click on next, you'll be brought to a screen that looks, if you've ever deployed a finance and operations environment, it looks very similar. In fact, it pretty much is exactly the same. However, we have hidden a handful of things from you. For example, you cannot select the geo that you want to deploy your environment in when you're doing a migration. we automatically select that behind the scenes, and it has to be the same Azure data center, same Azure region that your HR environment is currently in. So that is kind of a high-level look at what that migration process looks like. Once you click OK on that button, you'll wait a few hours, and theoretically, you'll just have a new environment. It is important to note that you will need to repoint your integrations to the new environment, because when you do a migration, you do get a new environment URL. It will be different than your current HR environment URL. And so you'll have to repoint any of your integration endpoints to that new URL endpoint of your particular environment. But because we're not making schema changes to anything as a part of this migration, your integrations should continue to work. Obviously, you'll want to test those things to make sure that they're functioning correctly, but we do expect that it will continue to work correctly. And so taking a look at some pre and post migration, what this might look like for a customer, I've got a few slides here. I won't spend a bunch of time on it because I want to make sure that we've got plenty of time for questions at the end. But the first slide that I've got here is kind of what it looks like for a customer who is using standalone human resources today with a single LCS project. You might also have customers that have multiple. This is just showing 2, but there could be 3 or 4 or however many LCS projects, depending on your customer. So this is kind of what HR customers look like today. If we take a look at what it looks like for a future state after the migration, someone who has one LCS project today, they might have a production, a sandbox, and there could be additional sandboxes if you've purchased those licenses and done it in a single LCS project. And so when we migrate, this will now become an F&O LCS project. Your sandbox will get migrated into a tier 2 environment. If you have additional sandboxes, you can migrate those as well into tier 2 environments. And your production environment will get migrated over to an F&O production environment. After that migration is done, your old HR LCS project will basically be disabled and turned off. If a customer has multiple LCS projects, the process is pretty similar. However, when you land in the finance and operations infrastructure, you'll only have one LCS project. So your sandbox will go to a tier 2 environment. And in that same project, if you have additional ones, you'll be able to map all of the different LCS projects and environments into a single LCS project, and your production environment will get deployed there as well. For customers that have both HR and finance and operations, it is likely that you are using the data integrator to move data in between those 2 environments. And that's shown here by this arrow that points back and forth for the optional data integrator. Again, you might have sandboxes and some additional tier 2s. And so what this looks like moving forward is that you'll wind up with 2 LCS projects on the F&O infrastructure. One F&O LCS project for HR and one for your regular F&O apps. And so we'll migrate your current LCS project over to a new F&O LCS project. And if you still have a need to integrate the data between the 2 applications, you can continue to do that using the data integrator. Likewise, if you've got multiple LCS projects today and you need to migrate that, you'll still land with 2 LCS projects on the F&O infrastructure and using that optional data integrator between them. But everything that's in the HR LCS project will get migrated to its own F&O LCS project. The last slide here that I want to talk about is kind of what it looks like for customers who have F&O today or even in the future, if you want to deploy your human resources applications and functionality and data in a separate environment, new customers have the right to do this as long as they purchase the minimum licensing. And if you do have the need to integrate the data between a finance and operations environment that has finance and supply chain and commerce and project operations, for example, you can do that using the data integrator templates that are available today. One last kind of final note here that I want to kind of point out is that we do have a few customers that are using a single Dataverse for both their HR and F&O environments. And one thing that's important to note for those handful of customers that are in that shape, they will be required to duplicate their Dataverse because you cannot have two F&O environments that point to the same Dataverse. So when we're moving and doing this infrastructure change, those few customers, if there is a need to have the HR related data in both Dataverses, may need to do some additional work to integrate the data between the two Dataverses, because that won't be possible. So with that, I am going to open it up for questions. I do see we've got a couple in the chat, so I will work through those questions. And if you do have additional questions, feel free to type those in. And then we'll kind of go from there. So the first question we got was, what about attract and hire functionalities? Is it also going to be part of HR module in Dynamics 365 for finance? Great question. So I kind of want to answer kind of two questions that are almost inferred from that. So the first one is that although the HR module will kind of remain in finance, it still is a separate product and will be licensed as a separate product. Just like finance and supply chain, like, some of the modules are supply chain specific and some of the modules are finance specific. The human resources module will still be licensed under Dynamics 365 human resources in the new infrastructure. So that's kind of one piece of this. But in terms of the attract and hire functionalities, if you're referring to our old talent attract and talent onboarding applications, those applications have been deprecated. They are not coming forward into the new infrastructure. In terms of our roadmap and direction around attract and applicant tracking functionalities, we have released a candidate tracking and request to recruit functionality, along with APIs to integrate with your applicant tracking system, or ATS. So that's the recommendation that we make around attract. Around onboarding, we did have a separate application in talent called onboard, which has also been deprecated, but we do have functionality called task management, which includes onboarding, offboarding, and transitions checklists. That functionality has been merged over into the finance and operations infrastructure and is now available in the merged infrastructure that's part of 10.0.25. And we do have a roadmap to continue to enhance and integrate that functionality in our next wave. So definitely keep an eye out on the roadmap for kind of what we're planning around the onboarding functionality. But there is new functionality, but it won't be the standalone onboarding application that we used to have with talent. The next question we had is, do we have any plan for ESS or employee self-service and MSS or manager self-service enhancement? Is it compatible for 1,000+ users? So kind of two questions there. Again, let's take the first one about roadmap around employee self-service and manager self-service. We definitely have a roadmap around what's happening with manager self-service and employee self-service. In our next wave, you can expect to start to see some of those improvements. One of the things that we're taking a look at now is how we might leverage Teams for more kind of self-service type capabilities like we've done with leave and absence. We're also looking at how we can use Viva, if you're familiar with Viva, to enhance that experience both in Teams and in Outlook from a personal productivity standpoint, with out of office requests, managing your calendar and so on, as well as things like Viva Learning. So we do have learning management integration planned on our roadmap in the next wave. And we do expect that Viva Learning will be on the list of things that we will integrate with. Now, the second half of that question is employee self-service and manager self-service compatible for 1,000+ users? Even in its current shape, it absolutely is compatible. We do have customers that have about 4,000 users. I think we even have a couple that are pushing 5,000 users that very actively use employee self-service and manager self-service functionalities in the standalone application. And that same functionality will be available in finance and operations. The great news is that the finance and operations infrastructure is actually far more scalable than the human resources infrastructure. So we will be able to scale to larger customers and have better performance in those situations. But like I said, we do expect to kind of see a lot of enhancements and improvements around employee and manager self-service in the next several semesters of development and kind of enhancing the product. I don't think we'll be there 100% of the way, by the end of our current wave, but I do think that it's going to be an evolution over the next couple of waves. The next question we have is if we have one F&O LCS project and just environment for all operations, and start using the HR module for employee management, do we also need to perform some action? Great question. So if you are using the finance and operations, so let's say you have licensing today for finance and supply chain, and you want to start leveraging the human resources module to track employees, positions, jobs, compensation, benefits, so on and so forth, you can absolutely start doing that. You can even do that today in your current environment. Keep in mind that you will need to go into feature management and turn on all of the additional features that are being merged in to the infrastructure, because they won't be on by default for customers using finance and supply chain. So once you enable those features, you can start configuring them and using them. So really the key there is just turn on the features in the feature management workspace. The second thing that's important to note is that you'll need to license the users who are using the human resources functionality in finance and operations. So again, you can continue to use your finance or supply chain licenses up until January 31st, 2024 or 25. I don't remember the date, back on slide 2 or 3. So just make sure you're planning appropriately for that licensing cost. All right, so we had another question come in. With US payroll taxes being deprecated, what is the plan for the future, as many of our clients are looking for one solution for both HR and payroll? Great question. So from a payroll perspective, although we are not deprecating the entire payroll module at this time, it might be deprecated in the future, and it's not an area that we are planning to make investments in. To your point, the US payroll tax updates are being deprecated next year, actually 2024, I believe. So we still have a little bit of time before we will stop making those tax updates. By and large, our recommendation from a fast track perspective is that Dynamics 365 should not be your payroll system. What we recommend is that you use our new payroll APIs to integrate with a payroll provider to generate the actual pay stubs. But you can use Dynamics 365 as your HCM solution to manage your worker data, your compensation data, benefits, leave and absence, so on and so forth. But payroll processing is not something that we are focusing on. Certainly, this is something that we do hear from time to time, that people are looking for an all-in-one solution. And so I would definitely suggest that you provide that feedback and submit your ideas out on the ideas portal, and solicit votes from your peers. I don't think we've heard enough feedback from enough customers to really warrant us, making investments into payroll. So that looks like all the questions that we have in the queue right now. I'm happy to kind of hang out for the next, oh, it looks like Sohaib, you have a question. I see your hand is up.
Hello, nice to see you, Rachel. I have a question, right? This might be an interesting one. So the thing is, why exactly Microsoft thought to bring this product back into finance and operation and not choosing any of the other products from the group of product? Like you see Dynamics 365 Business Central, it has also got the extensions model. So if was it just the extension model because of which Microsoft brought it back into F&O, or is it because the product was there already, or some other reasons?
I think there's a lot of points that went into that decision, right? Because obviously, you could ask, why didn't we move it to be a model-driven app like sales or customer service, for example? I mean, for one is, the HR standalone application started from the model, right? The packages that were the human resources functionality. So they are all written in X++. On that same kind of AOS infrastructure. And while there are a lot of similarities between the infrastructure between human resources and finance and operations, there's a handful of things in that infrastructure that were quite scaled down. And somewhat like infrastructure as a service, the old kind of infrastructure of F&O, was a little bit harder to manage and so on. And so with the Service Fabric, it opened up more opportunities for us to be able to save money from an infrastructure standpoint with Service Fabric. But because of the infrastructure differences in human resources, we weren't able to uptake all of the platform features like Azure Data Lake or the ability to edit Power BI. We didn't have SSRS reporting because of the infrastructure differences. So by moving it back, we get to take advantage of that functionality, all of that platform greatness that the platform team in finance and operations has been, working on and taking advantage of for the last however many years, without having to do a complete rewrite. Whereas like if we wanted to move this to be a model-driven app, it would have required a complete rewrite, from the ground up, because of the fact that it is written in X++, and we currently don't have a mechanism to, have X++ driven, model-driven apps, if that makes sense. Hopefully that answers the question, Sohi, but if not, feel free to come back and I can certainly try to help clarify.
No, it makes sense, to be honest. You have really explained it well. I'm happy that product is back at home. And any plans to bring more products back into F&O?
Great question. I mean, we're certainly, from an F&O standpoint, we certainly have a really big roadmap. A lot of our, net new product investments are being developed, on our microservice kind of infrastructure, which is a little bit more Dataverse driven and model driven, app driven. Because it does allow us, just like customers, to kind of deploy solutions faster. And there's certainly advantages to the Power Platform and the Dataverse being stateless, whereas the finance and operations infrastructure is not stateless. And that's what causes us to have, downtime in order to apply updates to the system. So, there's certainly a roadmap, for F&O in terms of entirely new products. I can't speak to anything specifically, but certainly investments being made still in F&O.
Nice. Thanks, Rachel.
Okay, well, look at that. That's a great Q&A actually. I think everyone got their questions answered in that Q&A, and I think we might be able to give you 10 minutes back, Rachel. Actually, so thank you so much. It was a really educating session. I learned a lot from it myself. So I just really want to thank you. I'm sure you've helped a lot of people today in clarifying their roadmap and their strategy to deal with this infrastructure merge. So once again, huge round of applause. Thank you, Rachel, for being able to make it today, especially huge kudos directly from the airport as well. Safe journey. And yeah, we really hope to see you soon.
Well,
thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Awesome. So that was Rachel. If you haven't ever seen Rachel, there you go. So Rachel, really good. So